This is Gary, K3OS. We're about to change the fan out on an Ameritron ALS 600 because this particular fan is noisy. You'll hear the original What you just heard was the original fan in the power supply for an ALS 600 solid state linear amplifier. The power supply is located on the underneath my desk. The ambient noise you heard were a couple of PCs and a linear supply, but clearly when I started up the linear supply, you clearly heard that. The other day I did change the fan in the actual amp, and I'll have details for that along with this. But right now let's just concentrate on the power supply, because this one kind of sounds like a airplane engine starting. Now, I've removed all the crazy screws on the cabinet, exposed it, and you can see the fan, which is right here. And I already know, because I have the replacement fan, that this fan is a little deeper this way than the replacement fan, so we're going to have to figure out a way to duct that air and to close that gap. So first thing is, let's remove the fan and see what we end up with. I've removed the fan, and I've added just a little bit of heat shrink tubing on the two ends of the wires. I merely clipped them so that in case I really wanted to bring it back, I wouldn't have to do it. Here's the whole fan assembly. Got the two wires up here. This is an AC fan, so I've put a little bit of tubing on there just in case I ever want to go back. I didn't have to therefore take off this particular board in order to unsolder it. Made life a little bit easier. Also found out is that this shroud, which was attached to the fan this way, the fan was actually holding this particular shroud in place. It has a couple of power resistors on the bottom of it, and therefore the mounting that we're going to have to replace is going to have to be rigid enough to support that whole enclosure. One of the things we have to do is identify where we're going to pick up the 12-volt DC for the supply. And if you can see it here, I'll drop my pencil in from the top. That terminal right there, which is the one right adjacent to the screw, that's going to be 12 volts. And that's where this capacitor here is attached, the positive lead is attached. That's 12 volt DC. And any of the screws, like here, or there's one all the way in this corner, those are ground. Everything's chassis grounded in this thing, so I'll pick up a ground terminal from one of those. So here's the fan I've chosen. It's the Noctua NF-A8 PWM 80mm fan. Physically it's the same size, and when you open up the box, nice box, you get all of these little parts and things. The only thing we're going to need is basically the fan. I figured out that I really don't need to make any mechanical changes to this. It'll work just fine without any spacer whatsoever. And so I opted just to tack solder the fan wires, the positive, which is the yellow, right to the 12 volt pad on the power supply board, and then I use just an eye and remove the screw for the ground. All the chassis screws are ground. So now we're just the other two wires, so I'm only using the black and the yellow. The other two wires are for PWM and basically tachometers, speed sensing, so we don't need those for this particular application. So I'm ready to now see if I can't get this whole thing back together. Things I learned when I was replacing the fan in the actual amp was there was one screw on the fan I couldn't get to. And I ended up using this technique. This is just an extension magnet. And notice that the screw and the lock washer will fit on the end of this one. And of course you can just pull it out as much as you need. And what I'm going to have to do is, and I pan over here and we'll zoom back out. In order to get to this screw, I'm going to have to insert this all the way along and thread the needle, if you will. But this will allow me to do it, and I'll let you know how I make out. I also had to use a slightly longer screw than was originally in there because the fan is just a little bit thicker on the mounting tab, but I had plenty of number 6 screws. Okay, here we have it. The magnetic trick on the nut and thing worked on the first try. It's all back assembled, and now we're going to give it a shot on the test bench. I did test this with the cabinet apart, top off rather, and it tested just fine. Can't wait to put it underneath the desk and give it the official test. A couple of things I did notice when putting it back together. There is a screw that protrudes right here from the resistors that are mounted onto the internal bracket. In the old position, the screw actually fit through one of the slots. I ended up just trimming off with an open-ended hacksaw, which I happen to have, to get rid of that screw. That worked all right. Or you can merely just bend a couple of these, as has previously been done, just bend a couple of these out of the way. The 2 screws on the top do not seem to be an issue. And I had no trouble in putting the top on, making sure I wasn't going to, and I also checked the wiring, making sure I wasn't going to bend any leads or short anything out. A couple of other things. While you've got the thing open, if you're going to do this modification, I have a very small and old-fashioned relay burnishing tool, which I used, and I cleaned the relay on the inside while it was open, and just overall fixed any other little thing that was seemed out of place. Nothing major. So now we're ready to put it under the table and give it the same test that we did before at the beginning. See what the volume levels are like. I can already tell you that it doesn't start up like an airplane. Now, one of the things that I did find out with the old fan, and by the way, in both this and the amplifier chassis itself, the fans go in reverse from typical. In other words, they blow in to the chassis. So if you do these modifications, make sure you reset it with the label pointing in, and that will give you the right airflow in both cases. But I did notice on this particular fan, if I spun it by hand and put it up to my ear, I could hear some noise. It is possible that after this unit was probably built in late 1990s, 97, 98, 99. So as of the point of making this video, it's about 20 years old. So the bearings could have been shot, and that could have been a part of the problem that was making the noise. Anyway, here goes the final test. So here we go. And there you have it. A whole lot quieter there. I'm going to move the camera around to the amp so you can hear the amplifier. I was sitting back in the little bit more like in the operator position with the power supply under the desk, the amp on the right side of the shelf. There's been a huge improvement in overall ambient noise. There's no startup noise. There is some noise from the fans. I mean, you've got ducting and all of that stuff working against you, but it's certainly a whole lot more tolerable. You may or may not end up having this particular problem with this amplifier depending on where it's placed The amount of reflectivity in the room, I mean, putting the power supply, for example, underneath the desk is not ideal. It's kind of like a little chamber in there, and sound will bounce off the bottom of the desk and the wall. Similarly, where I have it up here, you'll notice that there's a little bookshelf beside it. The sound can bounce off that, but overall, I think it's been a very successful and worthwhile, very inexpensive modification. So I would recommend this modification to anybody, and again, I'll have the part numbers in the description below the video. Thanks for watching. This is K3OS.